The train rattled down the track, its metallic groans swallowed by the murmur of weary commuters. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting a cold, unfeeling glow over the cramped carriage. It was a typical Friday evening, the end of a long week. People clutched their bags and stared into their phones, earbuds in, faces drawn and indifferent. But Jack Harper, seated near the middle of the car, wasn't like the others. He sat with his hands resting loosely on his knees, his back straight despite the weariness in his bones. The retired Navy SEAL had the appearance of a man who never quite left the field behind. His graying hair was cropped short, his weathered face marked by faint scars and deep lines that spoke of years spent staring down danger. His sharp blue-gray eyes, however, were alive, scanning the car with the quiet vigilance of someone who had learned to notice everything. Across from him sat Mrs. Eleanor Miller, a frail woman in her 70s with thin, silver hair neatly pinned back. She clutched a worn leather handbag close to her chest, her knuckles pale against the dark strap. Jack had seen her board at the last station, moving slowly, as if each step required immense effort. She had smiled politely at him as she sat down, but her eyes had darted around nervously ever since, and her fingers hadn't left the bag. Something about her unease made Jack sit up a little straighter, his instincts prickling. The train screeched to a stop at the next station, and Jack's gaze flicked to the doors. They slid open, and a group of 4 young men swaggered into the carriage, their voices loud, their laughter jarring. They were in their early 20s, dressed in hoodies and torn jeans, their movements loose and cocky. Jack recognized their type immediately, reckless, arrogant, and dangerous in numbers. They pushed past other passengers, shoving and laughing as they claimed the aisle near Mrs. Miller. One of them, the tallest, with a shaved head and a sneering grin, zeroed in on her almost immediately. "Well, what do we have here?" he said loudly, nudging one of his friends. "Granny looks like she's hiding something important in that bag of hers." Mrs. Miller flinched but said nothing. She clutched her handbag tighter and looked down at her lap, her shoulders hunching as if she could make herself smaller. The other men chuckled, and one of them, shorter but stocky, with tattoos snaking up his neck, leaned closer to her. "Hey, lady, what's in the bag?" he asked, his voice mockingly sweet. "You got cookies in there? Jewelry? Come on, let us see." The carriage fell into an uneasy silence. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes fixed on their phones or the windows, pretending not to notice. A man in a suit glanced at the scene, then quickly looked away. A mother with a young child moved to the far end of the car, her lips pressed into a thin line. No one wanted to get involved, except Jack Harper. He didn't move at first, just watched. His eyes flicked between the men, assessing them with the precision of someone who had spent decades reading threats. Their body language was casual but predatory, their laughter the kind that masked malice. They weren't armed, not visibly at least, but they didn't need weapons to cause harm. Jack's jaw tightened as he saw Mrs. Miller's hands tremble slightly on her bag. "Come on, lady," the tall one said, leaning over her now. His grin widened as he reached out, his fingers brushing the strap of her handbag. "Don't be shy." Mrs. Miller gasped softly and pulled the bag closer to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. Jack exhaled slowly through his nose. That was enough. He stood up. It wasn't a rushed or dramatic movement, but it drew immediate attention. The men turned to look at him, their expressions shifting from amusement to irritation. Jack was taller than all of them, his broad shoulders and solid frame a quiet reminder that he was not a man to be underestimated. But it wasn't just his size, it was the way he carried himself, the calm confidence in his movements, the cold steel in his gaze. "Leave her alone," Jack said, his voice low and steady. The tall one straightened up, his grin faltering for a moment before returning with a harder edge. "What's it to you, old man?" he asked, taking a step toward Jack. "This ain't your business." "It is now," Jack replied, his eyes locking onto the man's like a hawk zeroing in on its prey. The stocky one laughed, a short, harsh sound. "You gonna play hero, Grandpa? You're gonna regret that." Jack didn't flinch. "Last chance. Walk away." The carriage was dead silent now. Even the passengers who had been pretending not to notice couldn't tear their eyes away. The tension was suffocating, the air heavy with anticipation. The tall one sneered and glanced at his friends, who were smirking, clearly emboldened by their numbers. "Or what?" the tall one said, stepping closer, his chest puffed out. "You gonna?" The words barely left his mouth before Jack moved. It happened so fast that the other passengers didn't realize what was going on until it was too late. The tall man lunged forward, his fist swinging in a wide, sloppy arc. Jack sidestepped it with ease, his movements fluid and controlled. And then, with a single, precise motion, he struck. The sound of the punch echoed through the carriage like a gunshot, the tall man's head snapping to the side as he stumbled back into his friends. Blood trickled from his nose as he stared at Jack, stunned. Jack's face was calm, his body loose, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. He took a step forward, his voice like gravel as he spoke. "Your turn," forcing the attacker's arm into a painful lock. The man let out a strangled cry as Jack guided him downward, pressing him onto his knees with minimal effort. "Stay down," Jack ordered, his voice low but commanding. The remaining two harassers hesitated, their bravado faltering as they exchanged uncertain glances. They hadn't expected resistance, let alone a man who moved with such calculated precision. The tall one, still nursing his nose, spat blood onto the floor and barked, "What are you waiting for? Get him!" The smallest of the group, wiry but quick, darted around Jack, attempting to flank him. Jack tracked the movement with peripheral vision. When the wiry man lunged, Jack shifted his weight and spun, delivering a sharp elbow to the man's chest. The attacker crumpled with a wheeze, collapsing onto the train floor, clutching his ribs. The last man, a lanky figure with jittery movements, seemed to realize the futility of the situation. He backed away, hands raised. "Hey man, we don't want any trouble." "You should have thought of that earlier." Jack cut him off, his tone cold. "Sit down now." The lanky man obeyed, sinking into a seat, his face pale. The tall one, still seething, tried to muster some semblance of defiance. "You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know who you're messing with." Jack stepped closer, his imposing presence silencing the man. "You're done?" he said simply. The train car was eerily silent now, save for the labored breathing of the subdued harassers. The other passengers, who had been frozen in shock, began to stir. A man in a business suit cautiously approached, phone in hand. I called the police. They'll meet us at the next station." A murmur of relief rippled through the car. Several passengers began recording on their phones, capturing the aftermath of the confrontation. A young woman knelt beside Mrs. Miller, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Mrs. Miller nodded shakily, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I think so. Thanks to him." Her eyes found Jack, who was already stepping back, his hands at his sides, his posture relaxed but watchful. She managed a trembling smile. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done." Jack nodded, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me. They had no right to treat you that way." The stocky man on the floor groaned, trying to shift his weight, but Jack shot him a warning glance. "Stay where you are. Don't make this worse for yourself." The train began to slow as it approached the next station. The flashing lights of law enforcement vehicles were visible through the windows, casting a strobe effect across the interior. As the train screeched to a halt, a team of uniformed officers boarded, their presence commanding immediate attention. "What's going on here?" the lead officer demanded, his eyes scanning the scene. Several passengers began speaking at once, pointing to the subdued harassers and recounting what had happened. The business suit man stepped forward, holding up his phone. "It's all on video. This guy," he gestured to Jack, "stopped them when they were harassing that woman." The officers took control of the situation with practiced efficiency, cuffing the harassers and guiding them off the train. The tall one protested loudly, his voice full of bravado that rang hollow. "He attacked us! We didn't do anything!" The lead officer turned to Jack. "Sir, do you want to press charges?" Jack shook his head. "No need. Just make sure they don't do this again." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "Understood. Thank you for stepping in." As the last of the harassers was escorted off the train, the atmosphere in the car shifted. There was a palpable sense of relief, mingled with admiration for the man who had done what no one else dared. A smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing in volume. Jack raised a hand, motioning for quiet. "It's done," he said simply, his tone as unassuming as ever. He turned to Mrs. Miller, who was still clutching her bag but no longer trembling. "Are you all right, ma'am? Do you need someone to stay with you until you get home?" She shook her head, her eyes misty. "No, no. I'll be fine, thanks to you." She hesitated, then added, You've done this kind of thing before, haven't you?" Jack offered a faint smile. "Something like that. It's just about doing what's right." Her eyes searched his face, as though trying to understand what kind of man would risk himself for a stranger. "The world could use more people like you." Jack didn't respond, only gave her a small nod. As the train began to move again, passengers returned to their seats, the adrenaline of the moment slowly giving way to quiet reflection. The young woman who had comforted Mrs. Miller leaned over and whispered, "That was incredible. Thank you." Jack shrugged, his demeanor humble. "Sometimes you just have to stand up." The rest of the ride passed in a different atmosphere. Where there had been apathy and fear, there was now a shared sense of connection, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had all witnessed something extraordinary. Mrs. Miller smiled faintly as she stared out the window, her faith in humanity restored, if only a little. When the train pulled into the next stop, Jack stood, adjusted his jacket, and prepared to leave. Mrs. Miller looked up at him one last time. "What's your name?" "Jack," he said simply. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Miller." And with that, he stepped off the train, disappearing into the bustling crowd of the platform. No fanfare, no lingering looks back, just a quiet man fading into the background, leaving behind a train full of people who would never forget him.